Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Always glad to be here.
You're welcome. Welcome once again, Irina. So, the big topic, the biggest topic of the day, and that is the Iran US 2 week ceasefire. How do you see, what should we make sense of it all? What does it really mean? And is the ceasefire already broken with this attack by Israel on Lebanon? 250 plus dead. Tell us a bit about all these perspectives.
Well, I'll actually start working backwards as to how it all came about. Um, the last we heard was Donald Trump ramping up apocalyptic rhetoric about ending a civilization, Iran dying, and so forth. And then all of a sudden, we hear about, tense negotiations. Then the Pakistani prime minister comes out, asks for a 2 week extension, and all of a sudden, Donald Trump agrees. If all of this sounds too good to be true, it's probably because it is. Here's reconstructing the events. We come to find out that it was actually Donald Trump who asked the Pakistani prime minister to make that suggestion, and in fact pushed him into coming out with this public request. So what happened? Why was it handled that way? Most likely Trump realized that he needed an off-ramp to exit the situation, which was becoming increasingly more complicated between the Strait of Hormuz occupation, rising oil prices, domestic political troubles at home. Republicans are losing seats in conservative districts, conservative areas, and there's generally supply chain disruptions resulting from the current situation. So, among all of this, he did not see a way that he could continue the war effort, and certainly not at the rate that was necessary. And also with the US and many countries running out of weapons, to continue going at the same rate was just not logistically practicable. So he needed to find an exit while saving face and making it look like it was the other side that blinked first. His calculus was that he would ramp up the rhetoric to such a point that he would not be able to physically carry out what he was threatening, but he would scare everyone enough. So when that off ramp came, people would just be so relieved about him not having to, I don't know, attack civilian infrastructure, deprive millions of people of power, and so forth, that they would not question why all of this was arranged. The news of the fact that the prime minister did not initiate that move, but rather was pushed into doing so by the Trump administration, leaked faster than I think Trump was counting on. And I don't think I think a lot of the reactions to this decision came before this information came out. I think many people will reconsider how they view it in light of this new information. It is obvious to me that when you're winning a war, you don't need an off ramp and you don't need fake intermediaries pushing fake ceasefires in order to get the other side into the room talking to you. The pressure was still not sufficient to get Iran to come to the table of their own accord, even under space-saving pretexts. It was very clearly that they only responded after that gesture was initiated, and I think they probably realized that Pakistan was doing so at Trump's behest. So so those people who claim that this was a victory of some sort because U.S. achieved military air and naval superiority and destroyed a lot of infrastructure. Clearly, it was not. From a political perspective, it was an obvious disaster and a transparent one. At that, the fact that U.S. basically had to ask for a ceasefire, that itself shows you who was more in control of the situation. The party that had to sue for peace, so to speak, clearly is the party that needed that break more. Now, it is, of course, possible to interpret the chain of events differently, to say that Iran is completely irrational and self-destructive, and was willing to challenge Donald Trump at all costs. But frankly, I think even Iran understood that US had no means to carry out their plan. Maybe they would have destroyed a few power plants. Maybe that would have resulted in significant civilian damage. But since when has the regime cared about civilians? Only today they pushed young people and children to come out and join the fighting and to form human chains around the infrastructure to prevent US from attacking them and causing a human rights disaster. So we see that the regime was not afraid of challenging US even at a horrific potential human cost. But we also see that immediately after the so-called ceasefire was concluded, it was Iran that continued attacking not only Israel but also the Gulf states. And today, even before Israel returned to attacking Hezbollah, there were attacks on Kuwait initially, and then on UAE and so forth. Intercepted 17 ballistic missiles, 35 drones. Um, all of that clearly violating ceasefire. Moreover, it turns out that Israel had never agreed to a ceasefire regarding Hezbollah in the beginning, which makes sense because Hezbollah refused to be disarmed and initiated new attacks across the border, which is how the latest escalation started. And no one had proposed physically disarming um, Hezbollah. The only parties that were claiming they were doing so were Lebanese officials. Clearly, they did not get far enough if they got anywhere at all with that. So later on, J.D. Vance claimed that Iran falsely attributed the Hezbollah Lebanon situation to being part of the current ceasefire, but he also said that Israel is willing to restrain its attacks in Lebanon. Despite his claims, however, as far as I know, the hostilities still continued even after he made that statement. The ceasefire itself is very confusing to many people because Trump claimed that Iran has accepted his 15-point plan as a precondition for talks. Iran claims that U.S. accepted its 10-point plan. um, Trump spokesperson in the morning clarified that U.S. had agreed to preconditional talks, but that it did not actually accept those 10 points. Trump, in some of his tweets, claimed that the 10 points were a good start for a start of negotiation, meaning he accepted Iran's version of the events. Moreover, Iran made different claims in Persian and in Arabic, which caused even more confusion about what actually was the precondition for the current settlement. Even more confusing is the fact of what is happening with the Strait of Hormuz. Iran claimed that there was a broader understanding that the strait would be free during the negotiations, but that the talks would start on Friday, and therefore all the conditions would apply starting Friday. Then it actually froze its own decision to allow this passage of ships in allegedly in response to Israel's attacks on Hezbollah. Then it turned out that it had never agreed to a completely free passage to begin with, that supposedly there was a plan between Iran and Oman to jointly toll and collect money for the safe passage. In other words, to do exactly what Iran's been doing up until this point. Then Oman disclaimed its participation, and Trump said that he is considering um, engaging in that scheme jointly with Iran, which raises the question of why he was trying to supposedly liberate Strait of Hormuz to begin with, and why he was calling on NATO allies. And now, in the latest meeting with Mark Rutte, he claimed that he wants to exit NATO, which, by the way, would be illegal without congressional authorization. But what has that stopped Trump? So we are seeing a lot of claims flying back and forth, but it's very obvious that while Iran has suffered a lot of heavy damage, clearly it has enough ballistic missiles and drones left to keep firing. There are now rumors that Russia, China, and Belarus sent military aid while claiming that they would be providing exclusively humanitarian assistance to Iran. Now we have a confusing situation with the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran clearly intends to retain permanent control of and raise up to $500 billion from, which would be sufficient to rebuild a lot of its destroyed capabilities rather quickly. Now, Hexat claims that if Iran does not move the enriched uranium out of the country, as Israel and the US are demanding, US will retake it themselves, a plan that was considered risky without a very serious ground troop investment, and which was ultimately nixed at the 11th hour. So nobody actually knows what's going on. What's clear to me is that anyone who claims that US actually won that war clearly needs to review the definition of winning, because this is not what a victory should look like.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of noises, lots of noise before the start of the war, lots of noise during the war, lots of noise even as the so-called ceasefire is continuing. What happens during this ceasefire, Irina? So-called ceasefire. Does the talk happen? Where does it happen? It looks like to be in Pakistan or in another Middle East country. Secondly, what happens to Hormuz right now? Will the choke be over? Will the world get some respite? Though the prices have eased a bit, but I want to understand from your expertise, where do these are the two major points? One is the political aspect, humanitarian aspect. Second is the business aspect that the world is waiting to get reprieve from.
So regarding the Pakistan situation, yes, it's as of now, it seems that U.S. negotiating team will be dispatched to Pakistan over the weekend. It's supposed to be led by J.D. Vance, but according to Trump, for security reasons, Vance may not be attending in person. I don't know whether he'll be joining by video, and why that negotiation is considered to be unsafe with the vice president in attendance. None of that sounds particularly promising. If you cannot include the negotiation lead because you are afraid of a potential assassination attempt, perhaps you should reconsider the venue and the participants. uh, the other participants to be the same people we have seen in previous rounds. I don't know what, if anything, will make this current round any different from the previous. Now, actually, Iran has more leverage in terms of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, regarding the Strait of Hormuz, the plan, Iran finally clarified that they will be charging the ships during the ceasefire. Whether or not they will later lift that requirement as per negotiations remains to be seen. But as of now, that is the plan, and it doesn't look like US has disputed it. And the minimum payment per ship is apparently $2 million. We have seen only a few ships pass so far, including Greek ships. Interestingly enough, the Greek Prime Minister basically attacked US operations in Lebanon, immediately coinciding with the safe passage of the Greek tankers. We had seen similar reaction from the French once the French had arranged for a deal that would allow the passage of the ships at a cost. The political statement from France was also um, critical of what is happening, including of Israel's operations. Clearly, the cost is not just financial. Clearly, Iran is also demanding that these countries put pressure on Israel to put an end to the operations in Lebanon. Hezbollah remains a critical ally. So we are seeing that um, the prices dropped the moment Trump announced ceasefire, as could be expected, but I don't know whether that situation will hold if Iran continues demanding costs and if there is no significant breakthrough regarding this arrangement in the next few days, or at least during the negotiation round. What I'm hearing is that the negotiations could potentially be extended by a few days after their official deadline, but it is also possible that it could be a very long and drawn out process, especially since it doesn't seem likely that either side will come any closer to a serious understanding. And it's also in Iran's interest to drag out the situation as soon as possible and to make it as costly as possible for US to return to the field of battle. Uh, in other words, we are witnessing a very unclear situation, and this sort of ambiguity is exactly the sort of space where Iran feels most comfortable manipulating and trying to turn a militarily disfavorable situation into a politically advantageous one. It's not clear what's going to happen with all these disruptions. On top of that, US has announced that it would tariff any country that supplies arms to Iran, probably at the news that I have just mentioned. Russia, and by the way, was never tariffed at all. But interestingly, Trump has not named the specific entities that are now delivering arms. Whether it's because the news is pending for the investigation, or whether it's not a really serious threat, just a general notice for these countries to keep out of Trump's way, whether he is actually serious about sanctioning Russia, China, and Belarus after lifting sanctions from Belarus and Russia recently, and as he prepares for a meeting with Xi. Personally, I'm skeptical. Especially, I'm skeptical because apparently, without congressional authorization, the maximum he can impose is 15%, which he has already applied supposedly universally, but again, still not sure whether that tax is applicable to Russia, Belarus, which were initially not taxed at all, and much less to China. The supply chain disruptions will continue because it's not only the actual attacks, but the risk of potential attacks that is preventing operations from moving as they are. Moreover, somebody, unclear who, but most likely Iran or one of its proxies, attacked the Saudi East-West pipeline, which was thought to be a surefire way of avoiding moving fossil fuels through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if there is serious damage, that option will likely also be considered risky. So we are seeing a very complicated picture. If there's no quick and permanent, durable solution to the Strait of Hormuz crisis, I think the oil prices will start going back up. And if Iran continues charging all these countries, it will become eventually an extremely costly enterprise. Imagine the numbers of vessels passing through at $2 million a pop. Those costs will accumulate very quickly. Going around Strait of Hormuz is also not cheap. It's lengthy. Not to mention there are other proxies that Iran could weaponize in the long term to force the countries to move through the Strait of Hormuz. There's no solution to any of this so far. I have yet to hear clear proposals from anybody on how that situation will be managed. At one point, Ukraine suggested that they could assist in liberating Strait of Hormuz, but obviously that would require a coalition of countries, not just UAE, and and it would require some sort of a military operation. So far, we have not seen any clear agreement to such a coalition.
Absolutely, Irina. So, where is Israel in all these things? Is it a ceasefire only between Iran and US? That too, so-called ceasefire for 2 weeks. Attack on Lebanon, 250 plus killed. More reports coming in. Will this be a deal breaker, or is this a part of the overall strategy?
To be clear, most of the killed, I think at least 247 out of 250 were Hezbollah fighters. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that, even though that's not being reported in the media. Nevertheless, those people were clearly identified as Hezbollah operatives. Regarding everything else, Israel reluctantly conceded to abide by the rest of the terms of the ceasefire concerning Iran and other proxies. Reluctantly, because in Israel there is a very strong sentiment that not all of the military aims were achieved, with the nuclear program still up in the air, the ballistic program not fully destroyed, and many other key aspects of the military operations not being fulfilled. Certainly, no regime change, despite what Trump claims. Uh, this Iran remains a strategic, long-term, and existential threat to Israel's own security, and at the end of the day, it's Israel that's much closer to Iran than the United States. For the US, it's an issue of costs and politics. For Israel, it's an issue of survival and basic peace and function and having a functional society. Still, Israel's conditions were twofold in the very beginning, and we saw some of that reflected in Trump's posts and rhetoric. Basically, Israel demanded the liberation of the Strait of Hormuz as a precondition, or at least a long-term objective of these ceasefire talks, and um, the removal of enriched uranium from Iran. We are seeing that Iran is rejecting both at the moment. US did push for that initially, and it's still continuing to push for it, but it is clear that those are not the absolutely mandatory preconditions for the conversation. Trump has tacitly accepted that those conditions will not be met during the 2 weeks of the ceasefire, that they may be met in terms of a longer peace plan, but so far, not for now. And there's a lot of anger at Netanyahu about this as well, that he has not fulfilled what he's promised, and that he agreed to an operation without having the authority to finish it up independently of the US. And it's very clear that Iran is exploiting this visible gap in objectives and methods that Israel and US had pursued from the very beginning. The ceasefire has brought all of this much more to the surface. Nevertheless, the situation is what it is. Netanyahu formally announced that he is supportive of this ceasefire initiative, but should Iran not agree to give up nuclear program and other threats through negotiations, Israel would at some point return to the battlefield. How that would happen without the US and whether the US could return to the battlefield also remains a very open question. If US were to return in the nearest few months before the midterm elections, would that hurt Republican chances even more? If, on the other hand, all of that is just verbiage, is Iran not feeling secure, thinking that Israel and therefore US and therefore Israel will not be able to seriously uh, return anytime during Trump's tenure? So they've got at least 2.5 years of preparing for the next administration.
Absolutely, Irina. What do you think Mr. President Trump would be doing right now? Is he relieved? Is he very happy? No more roasts from the Iranian side, all those memes and responses and all that stuff almost look like the war was happening on that front also. And it's a good opportunity for him to move out of this and look for anything better for the midterms. Quick victory anywhere else, perhaps Cuba or anywhere else.
Well, Trump has already returned to the question of Greenland. He started lashing out at NATO countries for supposedly not being supportive. He discussed removing US troops from those countries, a wonderful opportunity for Russia and China to move right back in wherever that happens. All of that shows that on the one hand he is relieved that he has taken himself out of the situation where there was no clear ending or end game. But on the other hand, he also understands that he's subject to criticism because how it all went down is transparently obvious to everyone but the most hardline MAGA supporters who are now claiming that US has achieved a great military victory. But even from a military perspective, while, as I said, there was significant damage, that aims expressed at various points by Trump and his officials were not achieved. So I cannot say that this was a victory either. Simply destroying things without destroying morale, without destroying the means to continue future fighting. This is not a victory by any definition, no matter how you look at it.
Absolutely, especially his declaration earlier that we are coming, the help is coming, and it was aimed at the Iran public. The regime survives, though there has been a huge damage in terms of infrastructure as well as
Mhm.
people, all their top commanders, and all those things. What happens here? Means should they be happy that they have survived, or should they also look at how people are watching them also?
Well, Iran started by claiming victory and celebrating in the streets. For them, of course, survival itself is a huge victory, but it's also the sense that Trump was forced to withdraw prematurely. And the fact that they were able to take the Strait of Hormuz and to turn the negotiations into their own game, rather than the winner setting the terms of the agenda and the pace of the ceasefire, it's Iran setting the agenda, and it's Iran forcing everyone else to consider how the direction of where it's going. Now, to be clear, it's not like objectively speaking, Iran conquered US militarily. That was never going to happen. But the fact that US lost the will to keep fighting turns it into a presumptive political victory for Iran, and that is no less important. Let's recall that many of the wars after World War II were lost not due to the lack of means to continue, not due to the lack of resources or military superiority by the other side, but due to the lack of political will. And Vietnam is a perfect example of how that happened. While the current situation is far from the drawn out quagmire that was Vietnam, where U.S. essentially abandoned its allies after a very bloody and messy battle. Here, things happen much faster, much quicker, but nevertheless, the result is still the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what happens in this after these 2 weeks? The military buildup still continues. More U.S. forces which are already there. Some more things are happening. Where does it look like? Are you hopeful of this? So-called ceasefire. Something miraculous will happen because everywhere things seems to be very wobbly. The
As
nuclear question still remains. Iran still continues to say that they will have those options. That options clearly, does not gel well with the Middle East, especially Israel. And that thing, it's almost like back to square one, even back to behind that. Where does the option of negotiations and reaching a particular conclusion which is moving towards peace look like after the expiry of this so-called ceasefire? And especially looks like Mr. Trump may not want to get back there, maybe more noises, but not get into these things.
my sense is that the best way to achieve both goals is to prolong these negotiations for as long as possible and to deal with the individual incidents and provocations as they come on a very limited basis. Yes, US retains resources. It's actually moving another ship back into the Middle East. That, by the way, leaves other areas quite vulnerable and open. US has already expressed interest in trying to move into Cuba. So Trump has already his attention set on the next project. The Gaza Peace Board today presented Hamas with the deadline of disarming and agreeing to the plan by the end of the week. So that's also going to come in a few days. And after that is finished, the question is what's next? Are the Indonesian and Pakistani troops going to move into Gaza? Are they going to have the means to do the physical disarming? Or is it yet another show operation for show that ultimately has no substance behind it? For Trump sees, for him the best route probably will be gradual de-escalation. Probably, I think Iran on some level understands that some of these conditions will never be met. Nobody is going to be paying Iran reparations. That much is clear. Uh, there is no way to stop Israel permanently from fighting Iranian proxies, even if Israel agrees not to attack Iran itself, provided that there are no further missile launches from Iran. And of course, the nuclear program will remain a red flag as soon as there's clear evidence of activity. I think sooner or later there'll be some sort of a military response from somebody. But for the time being, I think Trump realizes that if he has to return to military activity, this will mean that the ceasefire, this will be the admission that the ceasefire itself was a defeat. So for him, returning to battle is tantamount to admitting that he made a major miscalculation and a mistake in accepting the ceasefire to begin with, or initiating the ceasefire to begin with. I don't think that is something he wants to do, even if some people will spin even that into a masterclass in wisdom and will claim that ceasefire was always meant to be a tactical break for regrouping. So I really don't see a political way to win this round. The only way to do that would be to use the ceasefire to actually come up with a better strategy, to actually rally Middle Eastern and European allies behind the scenes very quietly and figure out a way to return to the field in a much more serious and concerted way. But that is always an option, but I don't actually see this administration doing that, because at the end of the day that will require significant resources, significant preparation, and will have to be managed. The public expectations will also be managed very carefully, and the Trump administration will have to admit that they did not do what they claimed that they did.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. What about regime change? Is that dream of some of the people over? How do you think the people of Iran would be looking at the regime at this point in time? Because we had protests not very long back, and now with so many things happened in this war.
I mean, it's very clear that the regime has not changed. A few functionaries have changed. That is not the change of the system at all. If anything, RGC has consolidated its power internally. Iran is weaker militarily overall, but internal repression is likely to be stronger, and most people predict that sooner or later Iran will actually become more aggressive regionally. And if it is allowed to rebuild, it could potentially become stronger with the help of the Strait of Hormuz situation, with the fact that US just lifted sanctions basically on Russia and Iran. All of these things could be a serious break for Iran. Um, clearly, Israel will not tolerate a return to obvious nuclear program, but we're also not seeing any steps to kind of structure a regional plan to handle future threats. Maybe Ukraine will have a more active role training Middle Eastern countries and equipping them with new types of weapons. But let's face it, without actual attacks, there will be no opportunity to really test and train quite seriously against those things. So, right now would have been the best time to actually put that in practice, but we saw that the action ended before there was a real opportunity to integrate those weapons. The biggest takeaway is that US is not prepared for the new drone warfare based kinetic escalation, and so far while US has demanded a huge defense package from Congress, this new drone oriented uh, churn is not part of the equation except for some private companies that may be doing some contracts with Pentagon in the future. It is not part of the official R&D disclosure so far, not in any significant level at least. So US is left largely unprepared, and that means that if the Trump administration is to return to battle at any point in time from now until the end of its term, it may encounter similar obstacles as now. They may possibly be worse, and if the relations with other allies continue to deteriorate, Iran may find itself gaining assistance from unexpected circles. Unfortunately.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking of Ukraine now, Ukraine Russia talks. Will they start happening now? Some or will it just remain talks? No breakthroughs there.
I do think there'll be breakthroughs, but Ukraine has actually been pushing for these talks, and it looks like Jared Kushner and Witkoff may be returning. The reason for Ukraine doing that is not because they're hoping for any significant change. If anything, the Trump administration has become more aggressively pushy to for Ukraine to give up its territory in and to respond to Russia's demands. I think they hope that creating this fake process for the sake of show will actually stave off Trump from making those additional demands, and while retaining some level of coordination with the US intelligence. Time will tell whether that works, but that seems to be the only solution at a time where Ukraine is pressuring Russia quite hard, not just around the front lines on its own territory, but also by attacking the the energy facility and making it much more difficult for Russia to take advantage of the sanctions break granted by the United States. I do think that Ukraine is is moving towards a much diplomatically stronger position. Orban looks like he may lose the elections in Hungary. African countries, which had been previously supportive of Russia, are starting to show clear concern about their citizens being recruited and entrapped into um, lethal operations, and they're starting to rescue their citizens and even to impose criminal costs for joining foreign militaries. We're seeing that the Middle Eastern countries are, on the one hand, becoming wary of Russia and China over their assistance to Iran. On the other hand, grateful for Ukraine's assistance. In fact, an Emirati company even tried to buy a stake in one of the Ukraine's defense companies. The Anti-Corruption Bureau froze that deal by edge, but that's likely not going to move forward. But at the very least, we're seeing the interest in Ukrainian defense sector growing precipitously. I mean, there's nothing like trying to purchase a major defense tech to show the confidence Middle Eastern countries are feeling in response to Ukrainian innovation. All of these are signs that Ukraine's political position, not just military position, is changing very rapidly. And that is, of course, a major concern to Trump, who has basically put all of his chips on Russia. His position has not been balanced or neutral from the very beginning of his tenure. I think that may turn out to be a major mistake. Perhaps by engaging in these diplomatic talks, he may try to save face from what it appears to be a very obvious obvious pie in the face situation, but that also remains to be seen. Probably we will see a lot of pointless gatherings for a while until the military situation becomes more clear.
Absolutely. What about Pakistan? It's now the world's new peacemaker. Will it continue with that role? You know, personal friendship with the U.S. president now. So much more benefits to come by for Pakistan. Maybe the promised oil will come much sooner.
Well, I don't think that the oil is going anywhere. But in terms of peace, Pakistan is actually trying to take care of its own situation first. We are seeing that there is finally a ceasefire with Afghanistan as well, and the two countries agreed to some sort of a process after extended period of hostilities and hundreds of people dead. Whether or not that will hold remains to be seen. I think Pakistan was actually very reluctant to mediate in this case. I think the revelations by the Financial Times indicate that Trump literally had to push them into undertaking that role. And we saw, interestingly, that the reason why this came as such a surprise to so many people is literally in the day before all of this happened, Pakistan chose to abstain from a UN resolution proposed to Bahrain that would essentially push for the liberation of the Strait of Hormuz, and which was vetoed by China and Russia. China, let's remember, is Pakistan's top debt shark. There's no other way of putting it. Clearly, that was in response to a Chinese demand. Uh, and clearly, that has raised a lot of concerns because the same day the Pakistani Prime Minister was on the phone with the Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, pledging fealty while having essentially stabbed the entire GCC in the back after all their generous loans and contributions. Over this diplomatic matter. So we saw a lot of confusion over this matter. I think the Trumpian gesture came as a surprise to many, simply because Pakistan's behavior in this conflict was largely shaped by other forces, and we are seeing that Pakistan has been trying to juggle completely divergent interests between Saudi Arabia, with whom Pakistan, mind you, has a defense treaty, and not only has it
Right.
not contributed anything, not that I could see Pakistan being particularly helpful in shielding missile attacks, but at the very least, it could have been more critical of Iran. But let's recall, Pakistan has also had very close relations with Iran over various matters. But it also diplomatically completely abandoned its ally in time of need. So I think, despite this phone call, there's going to be a lot of questions and behind the scenes that will not be all that pleasant. Um, so we are going to see a lot of interesting developments. Pakistan may try to capitalize on the current situation to keep pushing a higher profile in other things, but frankly speaking, uh, it actually has created a lot of dilemmas for it as well. I wouldn't call it necessarily a winning situation. It is true that Pakistan's profile has been rising. As I mentioned previously, it has now been selling weapons, perhaps on behalf of other countries, to assortment of Middle Eastern entities and countries. It's also now a Gaza Peace Board member. It's in Trump's good graces, but Trump's friendship comes at a very high cost and may endanger the very forces that pushed Pakistan so high up to begin with. If Saudi Arabia sees that Pakistan cannot independently support its security needs, perhaps it will reconsider that arrangement, or at the very least stop backing Pakistan quite so vigorously. That's one potential consequence of this complicated game, that maneuver that Pakistan is trying to pull off. The other issue, however, is that Pakistan is of lesser interest to Trump as a country than a Pakistani crypto activist, a 35-year-old who seems to be connected to some of the top crypto supporters around the world and essentially is seen as a vehicle for boosting Trump's crypto ventures, some of which are, quite frankly, in conflict of interest with Trump's function as the sitting US president. So perhaps while Trump is extending his grace to all of the country as a result of his personal benefit from that particular relationship, that too may not last long. If that relationship outlives its usefulness, or if Trump decides to focus entirely on that one guy and sees that Pakistan has its limits in terms of deliveries, that he may quickly move on to some other new favorite, and we know how dangerous that could be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the thought comes to me, looks like Pakistan has, left Mr. Trump behind in the contention for peace prize. I think, that could certainly be the case. Pakistan today stands a better chance than Mr. Trump with all those things that has happened
The irony
recently.
here would be rich if somebody nominated the Pakistani prime minister, perhaps the Iranians can, and and he did actually get the prize. That would be extremely funny.
Absolutely. Be that as it may, when you look at the world seems to be, moving away from alliances. Looks like to be all alliances are getting exposed, that none of this will work in most of these cases you see. And looks like, individual one to one relationships between countries is going to be the future. How do you look at this? Almost the end of NATO, almost the end of all alliances, if you look at it from that point of view. When the Middle East countries, in spite of so much of that, they had to fend for themselves. Maybe a little bit of help here and there, but ultimately you have to live with your own neighbors.
I'm skeptical that NATO will completely fall apart. I think Trump is the major factor in the push for transactionalism the world over. I think the moment the U.S. policy changes, you will see a lot of things being resolved rather quickly. Certainly, he has generated a lot of distrust. Certainly, he has damaged a lot of relationships, and certainly, U.S. institutions have been staffed by Trump loyalists who may have to be replaced before some of these relationships can be fully restored. But that is a matter of time and commitment by the next administration. I do think that 80 years of close contacts and close coordination by Five Eyes, by NATO, is nothing to sneeze at. And I think both sides have a lot of to lose from disengaging from intelligence sharing and military support and coordination, to innovation research and essentially uh, the role in keeping peace in Europe for since World War II. All of these things, I think, have been important accomplishments, and I don't think, despite heated rhetoric from political circles, they'll be easily abandoned because of um, a group of overrepresented activists, Trump included, who've decided to upend the world order towards their own personal advantage. Um, I think I think we are seeing shifts even inside European far right camps that have, first of all, not been particularly supportive of Trump's Iran operations, for one thing, and second, they've been themselves subject to increased scrutiny from within. So a lot of this may be very temporary. Of course, there's going to be a long-term work to be done to restore all of these things and to strengthen them in many ways. There are things that need to be rebuilt. Europe does need to become more independent for its own interest, not just for the sake of US. I think it's very obvious that US does not, even at the peak of its power, does not have infinite reach. It cannot be fighting all over all battles, and as a matter of logistics, Europe needs to have its own resources to against immediate threats. That said, countries like Russia threats not just to Europe, they're also threats to the US, not in the military sense necessarily, but certainly in the political and intelligence sense. And I think hopefully future administrations will return to being able to distinguish clearly between allies, however reluctant and problematic or temporary, and adversarial forces that clearly mean to do damage and aren't just self-interested or insufficiently eager to please. There is a big distinction to be made, and I think because of Trump's noise, people have lost sight of key priorities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lots of wars, lots of division, lots of discord on planet Earth. Amidst all these things, the only thing good that was happening was, humanity made another attempt towards moon. And from there, it did not look a divided earth, it looked a full earth, one which was, from a happy image from that part of the universe. How do you see that? Vis-a-vis with all those things, you talk about all those things that are happening in our world. And when you see of astronauts, they talk about one beautiful earth from that distance. On Friday, it's splashdown. It's a hope for humanity, or or something like we will continue to see more wars happening.
I do think that it was a very hopeful moment. As I thought the images sent, they were absolutely striking and spectacular, and I actually hope we will return to focusing more on this kind of endeavor that gives people hope and inspiration, um, and find effective ways of managing it, and kind of inspire people to strive to something greater than just sitting on TikTok all day long, greater than just fighting with each other online over 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 what some influencer said about some political figure. I think in pe- I think things like that kind of remind us of what really matters, of things that there are bigger things than ourselves and our temporary problems. And uh, at the end of the day, we all have to share this planet. We also have to build a common future, and the future is so much better when it's peaceful, when there's cooperation, coordination, and when people exchange best practices, best ideas, best products, and do so in a way that helps make each other stronger, rather than looking for a way to be strong at somebody at the cost to somebody else.
Wonderful, wonderful. With these words of hope, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Shukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.